It's time for another book review, and I thought I'd change things up a little bit and give you a different wall to look at. This is the aforementioned antique clock in the background here, which I think I'm safe from it chiming in the middle of this book review. And then to this side of me, this is a really cool picture that I picked up at an antique store in Wichita, Kansas. It is a cutaway view of a Titan II, I think it's a Titan II, missile silo from from the original plans for it. So I thought that was kind of a cool thing to find framed already. So my lovely wife was the one that spotted that in the antique store. So there it is. So today I wanted to check out 1984. I figured last week I covered Brave New World, so it's fitting that I would get to George Orwell's classic of 1984. And this originally, I want to say, is from 1948. Let me just double check that original publication date. Okay, originally from 1949, and then Penguin Books picked it up in 1954, and this one is from 1989, I believe. So this is, of course, a classic. If you have not read this, this is definitely one of those required reading assignments for understanding the state of the world, because so much of our language, and there's so many things that harken back to this original work. So I don't think I'm going to be putting out any spoilers in this, because there's so much about this story that even if you know the ending, that it's still a very valuable experience to read this and really reflect on how much of this has, I don't want to say come true, I don't know if that's the right way to look at it, but how much of this is reflected in our modern culture. George Orwell describes a future society in which there's perpetual war, and the propaganda from the state is so pervasive that it even reaches back into the past and into the future, and not necessarily in the way of like time machines and that sort of thing, but in the sense that they redo news post-date, is that right? Post-date old or new articles to look like they're from the past, or go back into the historical record and literally change old records to match whatever is happening in the present. And that's one of those things we've seen a lot with, my wife and I were looking up something about related to COVID, and there were articles that appeared to be recent or that appeared to be older articles, but they obviously had been massaged to reflect the current party line. And I found that very troubling, that a lot of what Orwell is describing is very much in practice now. So one of the things that made me think of this again was I mentioned in a video yesterday about, at the end of that video, I mentioned that I kind of put Trump in the same category as Emmanuel Goldstein. So for the uninitiated, Emmanuel Goldstein is the villain, the kind of the ultimate villain in the book 1984. And you never see Emmanuel Goldstein. I don't think there's any interaction with him whatsoever. You just see pictures of his face. And they actually have I believe it's their 2 minutes of hate every day, that the general population is just shown on what they call a telescreen. They are shown a picture of Emmanuel Goldstein's face, and they all yell at it and scream and get all their rage out. But he is the villain. So if there's a plumbing problem in your apartment building, it's probably Emmanuel Goldstein. All these things are ascribed to him. If there's a terrorist act or something, it's probably Emmanuel Goldstein. So he is the ultimate villain. Now, what I find really interesting, and this is again kind of, I'm going to take advantage of George Orwell's storytelling and build off of that a little bit to describe some current events. With respect to Trump and and Emmanuel Goldstein. I think it's important to see that same parallel, how that's used. And really, I saw that used a lot with Osama bin Laden back after 9/11, where one of the famous instances of this was in the 2004 election between John Kerry and George Bush. Osama bin Laden allegedly, and I say allegedly because you and I have no way to verify what was or was not Osama bin Laden's actual statements, but he allegedly released a video that was kind of an underhanded endorsement of John Kerry, and as a result, it had the intended effect of steering people towards George Bush, because of course, you don't, if your arch rival, if the ultimate enemy in the world is even kind of endorsing one candidate, well, you should run the other way from that candidate. And that's exactly what happened. And I'm not saying, let me go and stop right here and say that I don't think John Kerry was, I think John Kerry's, he's a bonesman, he's a Yale dude, he's just as much trouble as George was, but George was supposed to be president, so he was the guy you were supposed to be cheering for. But things like that allowed that shift, that you go, well, if the enemy, if the arch rival is saying, if he's endorsing, like if Osama bin Laden goes, man, I sure could go for an ice cold Coca-Cola right now. Well, obviously you're supposed to get a Pepsi, because who wants to do what Osama bin Laden is doing? Same thing. So at the time when that happened, I was joking about making my own videos where Osama bin Laden was endorsing very specific things that were very obviously intended for you to go the other way, like endorsing Macs so that you knew that a PC was obviously the way you should go. Now, I saw a lot of that happening with Trump, and this is one of the things that, like I said in my previous video, this is what really broke a lot of people, was it forced, that line of thinking was so cleverly applied to the general public that you kind of had this, you had this weird situation where people would suddenly defend Trump even when he was saying the most insane, stupid things, because they felt like he's our guy, he's the guy we're supposed to defend. Or you had the opposite occur, and this was typically, this was happening more often than the other, was where people go, well, if Trump said X, that must be bad. So I'm going to flee from whatever he's saying. If he's endorsing X, Y, and Z, those are obviously very bad things. And a great example of that I saw unfold firsthand was, I had a customer who was a retired MD in Beverly Hills, who first told me about hydroxychloroquine, that how it could be used to protect against COVID. And this is before the lockdowns. This was actually, and this particular gentleman was a very left-leaning artist that in fact did a lot of anti-Trump artwork. So by no means a Trumper, in any way, shape, or form. And this gentleman, right before, I think it was about a week before all the lockdown stuff started, called me up, and we were talking about his order with us, but then he brought up COVID, and of course this is before COVID had really blown up into full-blown shutdowns and all that. So I wasn't really on high alert as I probably should have been. But he told me that, he said, hey, I got the inside scoop on this COVID deal, and go right now, tell your doctor you're going on a mission trip or something to Africa. He said, you tell them you're going to Africa, they will automatically prescribe you hydroxychloroquine. And he said, that will protect you against COVID. I was like, okay, sure, whatever. But, and he was like, no, seriously, go do that now. And, he said, get your family on it, and I was like, okay, whatever. And he could tell, I think he could tell that I wasn't taking it that seriously, and I wasn't. But so he insisted, write this down, and I wrote it down on a little yellow Post-it note. And I'm just trying to humor the guy and just say, okay, whatever. And I said, well, my in-laws ran a pharmacy, so I'll check with them about what they know about that, if they can find out anything. And he said, oh, really? if you can get any extra, he said, if you have any way to get it, let me know, because they're sold out of it on the West Coast. This guy was in, of course, Beverly Hills. And he made the comment, he said, all the politicians out here are on it, and you can't get it from anybody. And I was like, huh, okay, whatever. And that was that. Well, at the time, I ran around my warehouse showing people, hey, Dr. Dude is saying to get on hydroxychloroquine. Isn't that funny? And we all chuckled and went back to what we were doing. And I still, somewhere around my shop, have this Post-it with that written on it. Well, I forgot all about that until Trump made his famous comment about hydroxychloroquine and some of the other treatments with vitamin C and that sort of thing. And it immediately took this very legitimate treatment, and which now we know from a lot of the stuff that's since come out after some of the censorship lifted a little bit, we now know it was very effective in especially in early treatment. Once he came out and said this, and I think this was like in the late spring of 2020, immediately that became a dirty word on social media. Anything like hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, anything like that became a dirty word and became this really bad thing of like, you don't believe that, do you? You know, and still to this day, when I tell that story, I'll have some people go, oh yeah, conspiracy theories. Okay, yeah. It's like, no, this was a retired MD telling me this, who was militantly anti-Trump. So anyway, I know I'm way off topic now, but my point here is that's something I think we really have to be careful about, is when those kinds of players are propped up like that, of guys like Trump, who I really think in a very convoluted and very elaborate fashion was a very, very clever form of controlled opposition to a variety of things. And this is another, topic for another video to really do a deep dive into that. But I think that's anytime someone can arrive at that point where they can say something is good and everybody goes, oh, that whatever that something is, it must be bad. My own parents are guilty of this. I love my parents, they're great people, but if Donald Trump got on national TV and said, drink clean water, it's good for you, or eat fresh fruit every day and get sunlight, they would say, they would double check all of that, or just not do it at all because it's Donald Trump saying it. So that's where those of us as truth seekers have to be really careful about and very discerning about that, and say, okay, just because the villain du jour is saying the thing does not make that neither good nor bad. And we need to do our own looking into that and find out where that's really at. Now, back to 1984. Let me wrap this up by saying, I think the fascinating part of the story is not so much, I think a lot of attention gets put on the totalitarian, future, this dystopian world that he's describing. But really, the real story is one that's very apt to all of us, is that ultimately this is about a man whose last free space, his last bit of free will is in his head. The only place he has true unrestricted freedom is in his own mind. And at the very end of the story, he loses that battle. Of course, that is, of course, the final line of the story is, of course, that he loved, that Winston loved Big Brother. Winston, of course, being the protagonist in this. And I know I skipped over a lot. Just recap for those who have not read this, Big Brother, of course, is the euphemism or the way they refer to the government. This totalitarian nanny state is Big Brother, is looking out for you. Big Brother is there for you. So there's big posters of this staring face looking at you. And that, of course, is Big Brother. And Big Brother is your buddy. Big Brother's trying to look out for you. He's trying to keep you safe from Emmanuel Goldstein. So he is it's a lot of it's analogous to professional wrestling. You have your heel and you have your, forget what the name of the hero is, but the villain, of course, is Emmanuel Goldstein. The hero is Big Brother. And I think that's a really important take-home message from this, is when you strip away all the rest of the story, that is really terrifying, to have this battle in your mind over where that is your free space. And we're seeing this again more today than ever, where people's thought process is their last place of free will, and that is slowly being conquered. And that, of course, is what happens to our protagonist here, is you have him fighting a battle to maintain this free will and free thought in his own head, and he's not even allowed it in his own headspace. So very dark when you really get down to it. Very dark. And George Orwell is typically seen as someone who is kind of fighting on behalf of revealing this to the general public, whereas Aldous Huxley was almost making a sales pitch for this to the general public about, hey, this is what could happen. G isn't interesting, but doesn't really come out and fully endorse or condemn it. So I'll link to that at the end of this video, because Aldous Huxley has some interesting. I put that in that video, so I'll leave that alone here. But anyway, 1984, definitely a good book. Those of you who have read this and are familiar with the story, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Of course, we all know about the Newspeak. This is where a lot of the classic lines came from, is ignorance is strength, freedom is slavery, all those things. And the other one that I really want to get to that I just finished the other day was, of course, George Orwell's Animal Farm. So I have some thoughts on that too, but I'll save those for that video. So anyway, that is my rambling review of George Orwell's 1984. And just as a closing thing here, please, I appreciate all of you that follow this channel and put up with my rambling style on this. I am not a professional orator in any way, shape, or form. So I know sometimes that leads to some confusion when I stumble around on all kinds of topics. So I'll try to do better and separate some of these things out into more digestible chunks of related information to make that a little bit easier to figure out what I'm getting across. But anyway, that is George Orwell's 1984 from, again, I believe originally from 1949. Also, that date is important because this was predated by Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, I believe was published in 1932. So I find that interesting too, that he wrote this well after that, as kind of like, oh, really? That's how you think it's going to be? Boom, here's what I think. So I'll leave it at that.